Cuando se creó la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, nunca fue concebida como una institución educativa en sí, sino como un ideal, como una causa y como un poderoso agente de transformación. Esta es la diferencia entre la UFM y cualquier otra. La academia es el vehículo, claro, pero no el destino de lo que hacemos. Desde su primer día de vida hasta este preciso momento, la Universidad Francisco Marroquín ha existido para encontrar y nutrir mentes brillantes.
Intelectuales, impartida por Phillip W. Magness. Un par de recordatorios antes de iniciar. Si alguien no tomó los auriculares para la traducción simultánea, lo pueden hacer en el lobby del auditorio. Para esta conferencia, en la parte de preguntas y respuestas, vamos a utilizar Slido. A mi derecha y a mi izquierda aparecerá el QR code para que puedan ingresar y ahí pueden no solo ingresar sus preguntas, sino que también votar por aquellas que más les llamen la atención. Nos pueden seguir en redes sociales, además de los que están aquí presentes, en YouTube y en Facebook. Phillip Magness is Senior Research Faculty and Interim Research and Education Director at American Institute for Economic Research. He is also a research fellow at the Independent Institute. His work encompasses economic history of the United States and the Atlantic world, with specializations in the economic dimensions of slavery and racial discrimination, the history of taxation, and measurements of economic inequality over time. Prior to joining AIER, Phil spent over a decade teaching public policy, economics, and international trade at American University, George Mason University, and Berry College. He currently maintains active research interests in higher education policy and the history of economic thought. Philip is co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Colonization After Emancipation, Lincoln and the Movement for Black Resettlement. His most recent publication is the 1619 project, A Critique, a review of the long-form journalism endeavor developed to reframe U.S. history by placing the consequences of slavery and Black Americans at the center of the United States national narrative. His historical writings have appeared in several renowned academic journals, as well as popular outlets including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsweek, and Reason. We have the privilege of having Philip currently teaching a course at UFM on the political economy of slavery and abolitionism. Please help me to give him a very warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here at UFM, although the subject I'm going to be speaking to you about is unfortunately a depressing one. Depressing one in an intellectual sense, but also a depressing one for the human toll it conveys. But it's a matter of intellectual history as well, something that we as economic thinkers, writers, researchers in our own right have undoubtedly encountered. And that is the legacy of Karl Marx. Some 73 years ago, Friedrich Hayek wrote a devastating critique of the intellectual affinity for socialism that was emerging from the universities of his time. This was in 1949. What did Hayek point out to the intellectuals in socialism? Socialism has nowhere been at first a working class movement, as it claims. It is rather a construction of theorists from certain tendencies of abstract thought, which for a long time, only the intellectuals themselves were familiar. And it required long efforts by those intellectuals before the working classes could be persuaded to adopt their program. His words remain true some 73 years later. The intellectuals are still captivated by socialism. And I am here to speak about one such socialist who enjoys immense intellectual favor, and that is Karl Marx. To give you an idea, of Marx's impact. Consider the fact that only 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, the demise of one of the most tyrannical regimes in human history. It was not Marx's only toll, but the Soviet Union was one of the major contributors to a body count of over 100 million people in the last century. It was one of the major contributors to the spreading and dissemination of totalitarianism worldwide, to the Iron Curtain that swept across Europe, to colonialist efforts to expand Marxist socialism into the developing world, to the spread of Marxist ideology to regimes such as Maoist China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, the Kim family's North Korea, Fidel Castro's Cuba, and Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela. We still see the legacies in these countries today. And yet 30 years after Marx's regime in the Soviet Union fell, we look at his intellectual reputation in the universities and their dissemination into intellectual elite media. And I give you a brief presentation here of some of the major examples that came out on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth in 2018. The New York Times declared, "Happy birthday, Karl Marx. You were right." The Financial Times, "Why Karl Marx is more relevant than ever." The Economist, "Rulers of the world, read Karl Marx. Why is a totalitarian ideology that everywhere it's attempted has resulted in mass poverty and suffering and death still so celebrated?" No true Marxism is normally the answer that they give us. But if you think that's a dismal picture, let's look at the stats. In 2007, a survey was done of American university faculty. 1/5 of all social sciences declared that they were Marxists outright. That number has only gone up since then. Could you imagine if 1/5 of all social scientists declared that they were fascists or Nazis? Similar regimes that have similar death tolls. In 2013, the science journal Nature did a study of Google Scholar citations. They found that Karl Marx ranked as the preeminent intellectual influence in academic citations. Second was, I think, Sigmund Freud, and it trailed off from there into prominent scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians. But Karl Marx, his influence ranked number one. To show you how much worse it's gotten, in 2020, I did a study of university syllabi, what readings they are assigning. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto is the single most frequently assigned philosophical tract worldwide in university systems, according to the Open Syllabus Project. Outranked only by a couple grammar manuals in textbooks. The only other philosopher that comes close to Marx is Plato in Plato's Republic. Communist Manifesto is actually cited and assigned at 2 to 3 times the frequency of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, John Locke's Treatises on Government, and any other traditional reading in the philosophical canon. And that's only his most popular book, the Communist Manifesto. If you read Das Kapital, it ranks similarly to some of the other works. Marx's influence today is not just confined to Marxist economics, which are actually a fringe group, an extreme heterodoxy in the economics profession, but they have spread into other disciplines where he is now the mainstream. Marxist thought has spawned dozens of Marxist schools in history, philosophy, sociology, literature, art, architecture, or anything with the name studies in it. Marxist-inspired movements now include literary criticism, post-colonial studies, and the ever-present, ubiquitous critical theory. My purpose today is in part to ask why Karl Marx's reputation is so resilient from the disastrous political track record, but it's also to ask another question. Why is Karl Marx even relevant at all why does he have an intellectual reputation at all? And to understand that question, we must go all the way back to Karl Marx's lifetime. When Karl Marx died in 1883, he was an obscure figure at the fringes of radical labor activism. None of his books burst into the mainstream in his own lifetime, not even his magnum opus, Das Kapital, which was published in 1867. In fact, Das Kapital was rendered obsolete in the economics profession only 4 years after its publication by the famous events of the Marginal Revolution of 1871. That was when William Stanley Jevons and Karl Menger jointly discovered an alternative theory of value to the one proposed in Marx's book and system. Marx had constructed his entire economic set of beliefs around the labor theory of value, the notion that value derives from the work performed on objects. From that, he concluded that a difference exists between the surplus value of the good, that which is charged by the seller, the capitalist, the bourgeois, and the value of the labor performed. And this difference, you could extract a theory of exploitation. The laborer was denied access to the value of the work performed on a given good. And from this, the entire Marxist system flows. Labor is alienated from the product that it produces. Laborers outnumber the capitalists. Eventually, revolution follows. But Marx's system of value is wrong. Where does value derive? Value is subjective, as Menger and Jevons and later economists discovered. And subjectivity comes from individual preference, known only to the individual and exercised at the margin the moment the decision is made relative to the next economic decision. That single discovery renders the entire Marxist system obsolete. Marx's system, nonetheless, has gained a profound resilience today. Over a century and a half after it's first toyed around in the 19th century and presented by Marx, we see academia continuing to embrace it. And I'll show you some evidence here again. Academia, although it has always leaned to the left of center, in the last 2 decades has shifted to the far left. Left-leaning faculty, by their own self-identification, are now a complete majority in the U.S. economic system and probably most other university systems worldwide, which tend to follow the U.S. model. Most of that growth has occurred on the far left, which used to, only 20 years ago, consist of about 4 to 5% of university faculty. That has tripled in the last 2 decades, and most of it comes from identification with Karl Marx. So I ask, what's the paradox here? Marx was rejected in his own lifetime and obliterated in the decades following his death as an economic thinker, and yet he's revived today. Here's a quick timeline. As I mentioned, Das Kapital was published in 1867 and almost entirely ignored, except among Marxist activists. 1871, as I noted, it was rendered obsolete. Marx died in relative obscurity in 1883. In 1885, the first explicit marginalist critique of Marx's book, The Economist Actually Engaged It, by Phillip W, a follower of William Stanley Jevons, was written. And he noted that the labor theory of value had been rendered obsolete, and so did the remainder of the textbook. It continued from there. The Austrian economist, Eugen von Weywerk, wrote a book-length refutation of Marx's Das Kapital in 1897 on marginalist and internal contradiction grounds. But also, most notably for the economics profession, was the 1890 publication of Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics, the first modern textbook to attain widespread dissemination in economics. And what did Marshall do? He noted that Marx's system was rooted in circularity, enshrouded in mysterious Hegelian phrases, but fundamentally self-contradictory and not worthy of consideration. Economics had rejected Marx within 2 decades of his death, even though they had given it serious consideration. Even those who tried to make Marx's system work, despite the rejection of the discipline, eventually came to concede that it had internal inconsistencies. Marx's basic arithmetic for converting the value of labor into prices had a self-contradiction, a mathematical self-contradiction. Marx assumed that input values derived from labor performed on a good, per the labor theory of value, and yet inputs, including the labor, are purchased at market prices. The value derives from labor performed. Where do prices come from in the market? Unable to solve these simultaneous components of the equation, in 1907, the mathematician Ladislav Bortkiewicz proposed a contradiction to what was later referred to and has since become known as the transformation problem in Marxist analysis. Bortkiewicz's essay remains basically unpublished from its publication, from its original drafting in 1907, when he hit a mathematical dead end, until its rediscovery by other Marxist economists in 1942. Upon its rediscovery, they realized very quickly the implications for classical Marxism. The math will never add up. They've nonetheless tried to find other workarounds ever since. And yet, while Marx's economics were rejected, most other academic disciplines simply ignored him. I surveyed all the leading journals at the turn of the 20th century in law, philosophy, politics, sociology, education, and of course, economics. The only discussions of Marx of any substance are in economics journals, generally devoted to rejecting him. Elsewhere, he's basically ignored. Not even cited in law and literature and education journals in any substantive form at all by the turn of the century. In 1909, Harvard University published what became known as Dr. Eliot's 5-foot bookshelf, the Harvard classics, of what were considered to represent the Western canon of intellectual thought at that point in history. The Harvard classics were, exactly as they were described, a 5-foot-long bookshelf of dozens upon dozens of volumes containing original primary source texts. Adam Smith had an entire volume dedicated to him, as did other leading economic thinkers of the 19th century, such as John Stuart Mill. Karl Marx is nowhere to be found in Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf. He was too obscure to be considered. Today, in 2022, that pattern is completely reversed. Marx remains rejected by most economists and only considered in his place relevant to the history of economic thought. But in other disciplines, as we have seen, in sociology, philosophy, political theory, and law, Marx is now everywhere. Literature has entire subfields and journals dedicated to Marxist analysis of fictional texts. Education theory has been overwhelmed by the critical pedagogy movement of Paulo Freire, the most commonly assigned textbook in schools of education today worldwide. In the past 120 years, Marx has moved from obscure obsolescence into the intellectual mainstream. The great question before us is why, and I will propose an answer. But first, let's consider some more condemnations of Marx to show how thoroughgoing the economist rejection of him was. In 1907, the Economic Journal, the leading publication of the English Academy in the study of economics, and today one of the leading economic journals in the world, was asked to review Karl Marx's Das Kapital second volume in a newly published translation. The reviewer, C. Violet Butler, likened it to Don Quixote charging at a windmill, asking simply in her review, who should tilt at such a windmill? It was so irrelevant. Economists have continued to reject Marx, Even John Maynard Keynes in 1925 describes Marx's Das Kapital as an obsolete textbook without interest or application to the modern world. Ludwig von Mises, shortly afterward, says Marx's Capital is essentially a garbled rehash of David Ricardo. And to show that this is not simply a matter of free market thought, Paul Samuelson, in his 1962 address to the American Economic Association, declares that from the viewpoint of pure economic theory, Karl Marx can be regarded as a minor post-Ricardian. This is in 1962, midway through the century, and at the high watermark of the Soviet Union. Why, though, has Marx resurged in the mainstream? The answer I will propose, how did Marx go mainstream, comes from one historical event. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the seizure of control of one of the world's great powers, the Russian government, by a small band of Marxist adherents and progeny under Vladimir Lenin. There's a poster of him. You may recognize some of the art forms. How did Marx go mainstream? Other philosophers have speculated on this for a long time. Frederick Charles Copleston, in his monumental multi-volume History of Philosophy, even went so far as to speculate that had Lenin not taken over the government of a major power, Marx would still be obscure today. I quote Lauren Lemansky, the philosopher, who comes to the same recognition. In a later essay, wrote that without the Soviets, Marx's visible presence today would probably be roughly the same number of textbook footnotes enjoyed by other defunct 19th century economists of similar stature. For example, Nassau Sr. Raise your hand if you've read the works of Nassau Sr. He was a contemporary of Marx who matched Marx's citations in the 1860s when he wrote. So what is the answer? Why did the Soviet Revolution elevate Marx, and can we demonstrate this? I will propose to you that not only can we demonstrate it, but we can do so empirically, and the empirics are robust. The empirics are overwhelming, that this one event in human history elevated Marx from a fringe figure, indeed a competitor among dozens of other socialists of similar stature, relegated to the fringe of intellectual thought, and into the mainstream, even surpassing within a decade of the revolution the number of citations that well-known figures such as Adam Smith received. To do so, I turn to my own work with the economist Michael McCovey and an advanced econometric technique called the synthetic control method. Synthetic control uses computer algorithms to test counterfactual events that never happened versus the data that we do have. It solves or attempts to understand and empiricize one of the great problems of causality and causal inferences in the social sciences. How do you determine inflection points historically from events that never happened versus what really did happen? What happened in 1917? In other words, can we imagine a hypothetical world in which Lenin fails, in which the Soviet Union never comes into existence, and Marx's reputation, at least according to Copleston and Lemansky, is never elevated into the mainstream? And we argue that yes, we can, using a new tool called the Google Ngram database, which, if you know Google Ngram, is their scanned compendium of millions of volumes of texts in the world's great libraries. Estimates differ, but they are thought to have scanned somewhere between 10 and 20% of all books that exist in libraries going back centuries, to permit textual analysis. And textual analysis allows us to determine when certain phrases come into use historically, certain concepts decline historically as a percentage of the overall canon, and as we show, when intellectual figures are cited or decline in reputation. To study Karl Marx's presence in Google Ngram, we assembled 227 other authors from the broader intellectual canon. Philosophers from Plato and Aristotle, to economists such as Adam Smith, to thinkers who cross both disciplines, such as Herbert Spencer and John Stuart Mill. We study John Locke. We study the American founders. We include great works of literature, great works and authors of the scientific languages, such as Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud. We also include contemporary socialists to Karl Marx, who wrote in his own lifetime, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Ferdinand Lassalle, Johannes Karl Rodbertus. Popular names I'm sure we have all heard of and studied. They used to be of similar stature to Marx prior to 1917 in their citation patterns. Using 1917 as our empirical test, we asked the basic question: what would have happened to Marx's citations had the Bolshevik Revolution never occurred? And we construct a counterfactual Marx out of other authors who matched his citations prior to 1917. This is done by computer algorithm to remove the possibility of human error and bias in selecting the other authors. Instead, we throw all 227 into the list and let the synthetic control select what the tightest fit is to construct our counterfactual Marx. Our algorithms produced a synthetic counterfactual Marx paired to other socialist writers who matched him in citation patterns prior to 1917. And you can see the weights there. By far the largest are two contemporary socialists, Ferdinand Lassalle and Johannes Karl Rodbertus. Rodbertus being the German socialist, democratic socialist thinker, who his followers in the 19th century were consistently accusing Marx of plagiarizing the theory of surplus value from. In fact, Friedrich Engels spent the latter part of his life defending Marx from the accusation of plagiarism from Rodbertus. And yet Rodbertus is not known today except in deep historical circles that study the history of economic thought. Other weights are drawn from mostly 19th century contemporaries, some socialist and some not, and yet you can see the pattern. What did 1917 do to Marx's citations? I will show you. Quite simply, 1917, which you can see there in the dotted line, separates the actual Marx, which is the black line, from the synthetic Marx that we constructed from matched citations prior to 1917 and the computer algorithm that selected them. And as you can see, the break is immediate and sharp. This only traces through 1932, where we can safely assume and isolate that these are direct effects of the Bolshevik Revolution. But to give you an idea, that's what happens if we continue the pattern across the entire 20th century. Red line is pre-1917 Marx as a synthetic counterfactual constructed from the citation patterns of other authors that matched him before the Bolshevik Revolution. The blue line is the actual citation pattern of Marx, the one that overtook Adam Smith and every other writer in the Western canon that we considered over the 20th century. So we have conclusive evidence in statistics that the Bolshevik Revolution is what elevated Marx into the intellectual mainstream. We also tested for robustness using a variety of different techniques. I won't go into every one, but I will show you one of the more interesting, which is if we limit our discussion to German language books only. Marx wrote primarily in German, not exclusively, but primarily in German. So the question is raised, maybe Marx spread from the German language world into other countries. Not so. It turns out the same pattern is true. He matches obscure socialists prior to 1917, shoots off in reputation, is briefly suppressed because of World War II and Nazi efforts to actually obscure and hide Marxist texts. But after East Germany falls to the Soviet Union after World War II, what we see is the same pattern resuming. Marx takes off in reputation in German language texts. Similar Observations can be found if we restrict our analysis only to socialists, we restrict it to non-socialists. We find that this one event, the Russian Revolution of 1917, explains the surge in Marx's reputation. How so? After Lenin's band of ruffians seized control of a major world power's government, initially, newspapers and magazines and intellectuals around the world tried to familiarize themselves with this once obscure theorist that was only known in socialist circles and only as a competitor among many socialist traditions. As they were drawn to understanding the obscure philosophy that had a near cult following of the Leninist Bolsheviks, Lenin set the full energy of the Russian government he had taken over into disseminating and propagandizing Karl Marx's work. That included what we see an example here, the Marx-Engels translations and publication of the collected works of both of these authors into every language that they could possibly afford. These are only 4 volumes of the Mega 1 series, which was directly funded by the Soviet state in the 1920s. It's extended to dozens upon dozens of volumes and basically a publication of every scrap of paper, letter, note, and major work that Karl Marx ever produced. These were promoted by Progress Publishers, an official publishing house of the state government of the Soviet Union that spread it to universities worldwide. Lenin also mandated the teaching of Marxist doctrine in universities in the Soviet Union, and as the Soviet Union's sphere of influence grew, so did Marxist teaching. Lenin built a personality cult around Marx with statues, some of which are very familiar to us. Others toppled in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. He built a cult of personality of pilgrimages to Karl Marx's grave in London, dating all the way back to 1903, when he declared personally that Marx was the forerunner of the true socialist movement, the one that he was building himself. And he also strived to associate himself and his followers and his heirs in the Bolshevik movement via propaganda posters with Marx's legacy, proclaiming the Soviet Union as a true Marxist state. Propaganda spread across the 20th century. And though we cannot directly causally infer each subsequent movement in the mainstreaming of Marx from 1917, we know that they stand on 1917's shoulders. The familiar pattern has ensued. That pattern is that socialism takes over a government. As it takes over a government, the intellectuals rally to socialism and proclaim that new government as the true socialist state. That state then descends into chaos, poverty, famine, and genocide. It enacts itself with violence and sustains itself with violence, but ultimately collapses. And then we achieve the familiar refrain, but that was not true socialism, and the cycle starts again. That cycle has started again, as we have seen even in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. New regimes claim to be the true heirs of Marx, built upon that propagandizing of Lenin. What does this lead us to in conclusions? Although I cannot say with certainty that Marx would have forever remained an obscure figure, I cannot say with certainty that other revolutions would not have followed from 1917. I can say that 1917's events and peculiar events were what brought Marx's works, not on their own merits, but on their political fallout, to the attention of the world. And as it achieved that attention, it spread. By implication, the Russian Revolution empirically caused Marx to be cited in the next decade at approximately 3 times the rate he otherwise would have been had he followed the trajectory that he was on. And it only accelerated from there. So the intellectuals adopted Marx in the wake of the political adoption of Marx. Even non-Soviet versions of Marxism follow from, they do not predate, they follow from the events of the Soviet Union. So for instance, the Western Marxist emergence of the Frankfurt School in 1920s and 1930s Germany, which jumps into the United States and spreads across the New World's intellectual and university scene in the subsequent decades. Otherwise, we can imagine perhaps a world in which Marx today might only be as famous as Johannes Karl Rodbertus, Mikhail Bakunin, Ferdinand Lassalle, and other relatively obscure socialist thinkers who were competitors in his own day. The interesting counterfactual being that most of the socialist competitors, even though they subscribed to socialist economic doctrine, espoused a peaceful acquisition of power, not a revolutionary one, not one that embraced and turned to violence as its inherent movement. And yet Marx squeezed those other thinkers out of the socialist tradition and now has turned to squeezing non-socialist thinkers out of the intellectual canon. Where does this leave us today? In an intellectual conundrum, but it's a conundrum that we must also recognize rests on a very ugly and dubious legacy. And that legacy is that the USSR, the Bolshevik regime of the Soviet Union that violently overthrew a government and then proceeded to slaughter tens of millions of its own citizens through famine, genocide, and internment camps, is what politically gave Marx his mainstream stature today, not the merits of his ideas, but the conquest at the point of the sword. And with that, I thank you, and I will leave you to questions.
En lo que preparamos el escenario para el Q&A, les recuerdo a los que están aquí con nosotros y los que están viéndonos desde casa que pueden subir sus preguntas a través de slido.com o con el QR code que tienen aquí a mi izquierda y derecha. Gracias. Thank you very much, Phil, for that great lecture. We have some very, very interesting questions. We're going to get started with the following. Do you think UFM students must study Marx in order to actually know the ideas that must be fought? Not only Hayek, but as well as the other side of the coin.
Absolutely. In fact, I edited 3 years ago a short reader, a compendium that I call ironically the best of Karl Marx, which is a set of his core texts and readings to understand his philosophy. And the purpose is not to disseminate Marx. I'm not Progress Publishers out of the Soviet Union. The purpose is to offer a glimpse and an understanding of the arguments that he is making so we can better dissect them and better combat them in the world.
Excellent. Do you think that Marx's ideas are most known just because the left political science disciplines are better communicating ideas than libertarians?
Well, I think the problem here is Marx is promising essentially a utopia, even though he denied that he was doing that, but other socialist systems essentially have. It's very difficult when one side is promising utopia, equality, abundance, and the other side is simply saying, leave us alone. So we're at an inherent disadvantage because as long as we are honest about what we are offering, freedom and liberty, we aren't offering toys, we aren't offering prize, we aren't offering money in the sense that the Marxists are. So that's a disadvantage that we begin with, and it's something we have to understand. And I don't know an easy answer to that other than dissecting the arguments of the other side.
We have a follow-up question to the first one. Would you give any intellectual credit to any part of Marx's writing? Is it all bad scholarly work?
Well, I wouldn't say it's all bad scholarly work. I would say, to echo Mises, it is garbled David Ricardo. It is a jumbling and reiteration of other 19th century theorists, overlaid with dense Hegelian ideology. In that sense, it's a glimpse into how certain people thought of the world at that time. And there are some empirical observations. He does notice poverty. He does notice working conditions that were specific to 19th century England. As a historical document, that's interesting. It's a record. As something to build upon today, I think it's entirely obsolete.
Why do so many people frame Marx but not the person that implemented his ideology? After all, they are interpreters of Marx's beliefs.
Absolutely. And if you notice one thing about Marxist intellectuals, they are notoriously schismatic. They make medieval churches look unified. Marxist followers fight among themselves over claimants and interpretations of who gets to be the true Marx. And I think the interesting thing here is if you study who the true Marx is, there is no true Marx. Rather, it's a legacy of Marxist thought that is built upon a political event and has hived out and split out from there.
Okay. If the Russian Revolution caused Marx's popularity, why did his reputation not diminish after the USSR's fall?
Well, I think it initially did diminish. In fact, in 1991, there were news articles that proclaimed the end of Marxism as a serious form of intellectual thought. But for political reasons, Marxist ideologues and intellectuals resurged and reinvented and repackaged him. In some ways, I reflect on this as a failure of critics of Marx, a failure of proponents of a free society to successfully bury the failed ideas in the wake of the Soviet Union. Much as, when Nazism and fascism fell after World War II, they were permanently discredited in the intellectual mind. Yet strangely, that never happened for Marx, and it allowed an opening, an opportunity for reinterpretation that intellectuals have seized, and they've precisely been able to do so by disassociating themselves from the Soviet Union, claiming that the Soviet Union was not true Marxism, that they had another path, that they do it right the next time. Excuse me.
I don't know if you've heard this phrase, never socialist, always free. What's your take on it?
I think it is the answer. Socialism, wherever it's tried, has left a track record of bodies, of death, of destruction, of genocide, of famine, of poverty, of failure to deliver on everything that it's promised. We should take that track record seriously. It's not an error in the way that socialism was attempted to be implemented. It's rather a root of the ideas of socialism itself that yields that same failure.
We can also take questions from the audience if anybody wants to come up to the microphones. Do you think there's a cognitive bias towards Marx because academics separate his ideas from the consequences of communist regimes, especially murders, huge death tolls?
That is absolutely the case, and I think that's what we see in the statistics here. Academics do not want to be associated with the Soviet Union. Oddly, they did in the 1920s and 30s, and even into the middle of the 20th century. Academics on the left thought the Soviet Union was a viable competitor to free market economies. Even after they recognized some of the atrocities of Lenin and Stalin, they thought that the Soviet Union could reform itself and become a democratic socialist state or a truer Marxist state. And yet, when those failures were revealed after 1991, they ran the other direction. They claimed to have never been invested in Soviet socialism and simply found other regimes. The same pattern happened in the late 2010s, or late 2000s, early 2010s, when Venezuela was seen as the rising socialist state. The intellectuals flocked to it. They went there and they proclaimed that Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro had finally figured it out and done it right. How many intellectuals claim Venezuela today is a success story? Very few. So there's a pattern among Marxist and left-wing intellectuals to gravitate towards political Marxism when it's on the rise, and then claim to never have association with it and run away when its errors and faults and problems are exposed. So there's never culpability for what they're doing. There's never a reckoning with the legacy that they leave even immediately behind us in recent history. And I think that's the real problem. But what we see in our story of the statistics and what we see looking back at the intellectual history You cannot have Marxist theory today as a mainstream intellectual venue, as a mainstream endeavor, without the political elevation that comes from these regimes, these horrific regimes.
How would you compare the Nazi regime to the Russian regime that gave rise to Marx's writings?
Absolutely. It's a very tricky and difficult question because they do come from different ends of the political spectrum, at least in the traditional sense. But I think Mises was absolutely right when he pointed out that the Nazis and the Marxists were both Hegelian thinkers, conflict thinkers, thinkers that derived from a common set of ideas. The Nazis were right-wing Hegelians. The Marxists were left-wing Hegelians. And we can go all the way to the other end of the political spectrum for the observation of George Orwell at the outbreak of World War II. He studied the Soviet regime famously and wrote about it in Animal Farm, but he also was a keen observer of the Nazi regime and was horrified by its rise and the descent of the European continent into tyranny. And one of his most prescient observations is he realized that Nazi Germany had achieved, through similar means, a de facto condition of state control of the entire economy and mobilization of that economy for military purposes that matched one other state in the world, the Soviet Union. So through different means from different ends of the political spectrum, but through similar commonalities and themes of totalitarianism, they had achieved basically the same thing.
What's your opinion on the argument that Marxist ideologies are being pushed on students through identity politics, primarily in the US?
Yes. If you read some of the literature of the identity politics movements, these are mostly derivative of what we refer to as critical theory. That's critical race theory, critical pedagogy theory, critical gender studies, and so forth. These are explicitly Marxist doctrines in their origin. So critical theory itself emerges from the Frankfurt School in the 1930s. Max Horkheimer is one of the first disseminators of the idea. He juxtaposes critical theory against traditional theory being explanatory, critical theory, he claims, being emancipatory, but emancipatory in the sense of emancipating the proletariat against the bourgeois masters of society, effectively. Critical theory adaptations have moved away from the traditional Marxist class lines to looking at other dividing lines, race, gender, religion, and so forth. Critical race theory emerged a half century later in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. But when it did, and you can see this in the founders of the identity politics studies that have emerged around critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, at the formative conferences of these events in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they wrote memoirs. Those memoirs noted ironically, and yet also seriously, that these were gatherings of Marxists and that they had drawn upon Marxist critical theory. Their aim was to overturn capitalism. Their aim was to overturn philosophical liberalism and expose the flaws of competitor traditional theories with an emancipatory critical race theory. Oddly enough, though, because Marxists are schismatic, they fight against each other, the proponents of critical race theory run into direct collision with proponents of traditional critical class theory and other forms of theory. So there are internal fights. That's been true of the Marxists since the Bolshevik era, since the split between Stalin and Trotsky and other Bolsheviks that were purged from the original Soviet state. And yet we see other iterations of that, but I think it's absolutely true that critical theories today and that academic intellectual world is explicitly derivative of a form of Marxist study, and that form of Marxist study is the older critical theory tradition.
Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel with regards to academia in the US? Has cancel culture become something that makes people react in a certain way to kind of lean the tide in a different direction?
Absolutely. So I draw on the theories of James M. Buchanan, the great public choice theorist here, who had an interesting observation. In 1971, he wrote a great little essay reflecting on campus radicalism of the 1960s. The first wave of Marxist and related movements moving onto campus and really displacing other faculty. And he observed that faculty operate universities from a mindset as if they are protected behind an ivy-covered wall, and that ivy-covered wall only exists to separate them from the public. And their only expectation from the public is to continue tossing bags of money over the wall for academia to do with it whatever they want. It's an interesting analogy, and I think it's true today that academics expect the taxpayers to fund and subsidize them. But what Buchanan pointed out is the patience of the taxpayers wears thin. Taxpayers are only willing to subsidize higher education insofar as they think it has returns to society. And traditionally, those returns have been scientific advancement, technology, medicine, knowledge, training of the next generation to be productive members of society and to be critical thinkers in their own right, and to achieve careers that are meaningful. Academia is seen as an entry point into careers. What Buchanan noted at the time was that the further that academia drifts away from these traditional functions and into outright political activism, only servicing itself, the more it alienates itself from the public stated mission that it uses to raise funds and appropriate funds from the taxpayers. In other words, the further that academia drifts to the left, the more it bites the hand that feeds it. And at some point, there's going to be a turn. At some point, there's a breaking point when the public says we're no longer willing to toss bags of money over the wall. We're going to start actually asking what you do with that money. And we're already seeing that right now as a derivative feature of what we saw in the data there, the leftward shift that's occurred in the last 15 to 20 years.
It's going to be interesting to see your next paper regarding this.
We'll see if I'm right.
Here's an interesting question. Would you prefer to live with freedom as a poor man in Tanzania or rich but censored in China?
I would go with poverty, but freedom. The reason being a matter of conscience. Because if riches derived from the support and existence of a totalitarian state that was exploiting that wealth, ironically, from other people by victimizing them, I couldn't live with myself. And I'd hope that anyone with a conscience would answer the same thing. And I think this is true of most socialist regimes in history. They are some of the most unequal societies in existence in all of human history, even though they are claimed to operate on the principle of equality. There's always a very small group of elite at the top that have the privileges afforded to them by the state, and then mass poverty, misery, and death for everybody else. So as a matter of ethics, I would say no, I'd reject that.
How do you think we can fight these false utopian ideas, Marx says, in a low education level country such as Guatemala?
Point out the track record everywhere this has been tried and hold their feet to the fire. Do not let them engage in the rhetorical sleight of hand that says true Marxism has never been tried. The Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, North Korea, and Venezuela and Cuba are not true Marxism. Read the words of Castro and Maduro and Chavez and Stalin and Lenin. They all proclaim themselves as true adherents to and theorists of Marxism. And in fact, these dictatorial figures were often scholars of Marxism in their own right. They disseminated and believed and wrote on and theorized about the very same ideology that they promoted. If socialism has to confront and reckon with its own track record, that track record becomes obvious, and that's a track record of death.
I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit just to see if we can tackle it a little better. Marxism tackles an innate human desire, and obviously incorrectly. Do you see Austrian economy or Austrian economists having a tool to touch upon not only rational thought, but also the feeling aspect that Marxism sometimes use in its favor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tool has existed since the founding of the Austrian school by Karl Marx in 1871. As we saw in the economics discipline, if we confine our studies only to economics, Austrian thought and free market thought more broadly won the debate. And they won it before 1917. And they won it by reason, by arguments that seriously engaged and then deconstructed the opposing side of Marx's views. They won it by open intellectual debate. And I think there's a track record that we can look to and draw upon. And one of the reasons why the economics discipline has proved fairly resilient to Marxist theorizing, even though it's attempted to insert itself, unlike the rest of the academy, is because economics early on seriously engaged with and countered Marxist doctrine and found the errors, pointed out the errors, and calmly walked readers through those errors in plain language, accessible language, as well as high theory. So I think there's a model there in Austrian economics and its derivatives. You know, the old saying is Austrian economics became all of economics in a way because Menger's ideas were disseminated popularly, because they were absorbed. Subjective valuation and marginalism was absorbed into the mainstream of the discipline, insofar as there was no longer, at least immediately in the aftermath of Menger's ideas, a need to distinguish an Austrian school because it became economics itself. And so far, it's proven very resilient, precisely because it has the tools that these other disciplines do not, that equip it to combat errors and bad ideas and the political legacy.
We have a question here from the audience.
First of all, thank you very much for your time. It's very interesting. I have a question pertaining to the modern youth. I don't think it's sorry.
There we go.
Oh my God. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for your time.
Thank
you. You know, talking in a modern sense, there's a lot of disillusionment with the youth, and I don't know if you've seen, but I've heard that you know, Marxist doctrine, communism, socialism is very popular with youth, especially right now. How do you think that could be approached better? And do you think that capitalism and these models have a better alternative to what the youth want in, say, like a communist model in, for example, like in the United States or something?
Well, we've reached the point in historical memory that the youth today were not alive when the Soviet Union existed. We've passed the generation in which people still remember that aspect of communism and socialism. But other socialist regimes did outlive the Soviet Union. We see them in the world today, and they're tyrannical. We know North Korea. We see China's persecution of ethnic minorities, effectively engaging in genocide, and the suppression of its own political history. You cannot speak of Tiananmen Square in China openly. It's censored. It's relegated to the Orwellian memory hole. We see the track record of the collapse and destruction of the Venezuelan economy and society, a formerly free society that was prosperous, that's now in abject poverty, rampant inflation, and political persecution. We need to remind the youth of today that the stories are not only stories of the past, of long defeated regimes of the Soviet Union, but of still continuing regimes that engage in the same atrocities if we look around us. And that's the track record that they need to go on. And one thing I'd urge everyone to do is point out in recent iterations of attempts to create socialist Marxist states, such as Venezuela, even as recently as a decade ago when they were on the rise, they were seen as trendy among the intellectuals. The intellectual Marxists flocked to Venezuela. Famous actors and media stars and intellectual elites and academics on the left went to Venezuela to meet with Hugo Chavez. and declared that he had finally done it right. A decade later, those intellectuals are no longer going down there. They're no longer appearing on TV to celebrate the victories of the Venezuelan regime. There's a reason for that. It's already failing. And that's what we can point out.
Thank you very much.
As a follow-up question to that one, do you think there's a strategy on the left to try to erase history?
Absolutely. Well, they want to not only erase history, but they want to disassociate themselves from history. Some of the extreme versions of this even try to rebrand the Soviet Union as, quote, state capitalism. There's an oxymoron. There's a self-contradiction. We should not allow them to do that. We see this throughout some of the rhetoric that's used, including the class I'm teaching here at UFM. We'll be talking about later tonight. Now they're trying to rebrand historical instances of slavery, plantation slavery, as forms of capitalism, even though the slave owners themselves declared that capitalism and Adam Smith and the doctrines of the free market were antithetical to slavery. Do not let them play these word games. Own their history and remind them of their history, but also own and celebrate our own history. Free market thinkers such as Adam Smith led the charge of abolition of slavery. Free market thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek led the charge for the abolition of socialism in the Soviet Union in diagnosing these errors, and led the charge against the Nazi regime that persecuted the Austrian school. We need to embrace and celebrate our own history, which has a better and truer story of fighting threats to freedom and tyrannical regimes, whether they're from the far right, the far left, or throwbacks to an antiquated slavery regime. Freedom is emancipatory. Marxism is not.
We have time for one final question here from the audience.
Okay. Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
So, well, from my point of view, Guatemala is a very rich country with a lot of potential.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, it has a very poor society with many, many inequalities. So regarding this, what do you think we can do with the fact that poor and uneducated people, and also educated people, as we just have seen in your presentation, can be easily manipulated with nowadays media into utopian Marxist ideals? And taking this in account, I'm gonna ask the hard question. Do you think democracy as it works today really works?
Yeah. These are very difficult questions. One thing I will say, we do know the formula of prosperity because we've seen it across the developing world. And what is that formula? Economic freedom, sound, robust property rights, elimination of corruption, open exchange, and an opportunity to advance yourself, to develop your own personal human capital. The freer societies across the world, as we've seen from indexes like economic freedom of the world, also tend to be the more prosperous. And we also know that the freer societies and more prosperous societies are more consistent with democracy itself. So here's a paradox that I'd point out. Marxism, socialism, and these other similar related doctrines often claim to be the true Democrats, the true supporters of democracy. And yet whenever they seize power, whenever they win an election, what's the first thing that falls by the wayside? It's not the markets, because markets can go underground. Black markets can still exist. There's still trade and exchange in Venezuela today. There's trade and exchange in Cuba. But democracy is long since gone in those countries. Marxism and socialism does attack markets. It does attack prosperity. It does attack private property, but it always attacks the political system that could potentially topple it first. This happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in China. It happened in Cuba, Venezuela. It happened in Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe, one of the most disastrous rulers of modern African history, came to power declaring himself a socialist, a follower of the doctrines of Marx. And what did he do after he won his first election? He unleashed his troops, his private militias, to engage in genocide against the opposition, the people that voted for the opposing side. And these were not rich people on the opposing side. These were black Africans that were born into poverty that simply backed another candidate. This was true in Cuba as well. This is true in Venezuela today. Because wherever socialism comes to a country, wherever Marxist doctrine seizes control, its version of democracy is democracy represented by the leadership of that entity. They claim to speak on behalf of the people, but the people never have a true vote and never have a true say. So if you want to engage the question of democracy, point out that socialism is the surest way to kill democracy.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you. All right.
En el alba de límpidos cielos, horizontes se extienden sin fin, juventudes con nuevos anhelos, los descubren en la marroquí. Estudiantes, unamos esfuerzos en la búsqueda de toda verdad. Acercaos que somos hermanos en el ansia por la libertad. Libertad de explorar los confines de este mundo y de nuestro deber. Libertad de elegir nuestros fines que esperamos saber defender.